Hi, I'm Doug, and in this video, I'm going to show you how I made a shop stool out of two 2x4s. I designed and built this stool for the Modern Maker Podcast 2x4 challenge that they held a few months back. After sketching it out and modeling it in Fusion 360, I came up with a design I was pretty happy with. Let's get started. I had picked up 4 2x4s at our local lumber yard, and I picked the best 2 for this build. To create the seat, I channeled my inner make, build, modify, and transferred my design to a piece of cardboard. The Fusion 360 drawing helped quite a bit here, especially with the diameter of the arc. This was my first time cutting out cardboard on the bandsaw, and overall it worked great. The only tip I have is just cut right on the line, instead of kind of next to the line like I did and then try to trim it up later. Supported cuts are fine, but it doesn't trim well without a zero clearance base or insert. I trimmed all the pieces for the seat on the table saw to remove the rounded edges and to prep the sides for glue up. The trimming process threw off my measurements a touch, and I had to use some of the offcuts to add a little width. Once I figured out the orientation, I started the glue up. I did my best to keep the boards flat with each other as I was gluing them up, but I wasn't too worried about perfect alignment. When you're using a softwood like pine, leveling out the seams later is really simple. Once the glue dried, I used a chisel and a card scraper to remove the dried glue. I transferred the design from my template onto the wood, and then cut the shape out over at the bandsaw. After securing the seat to my table with some wedges, I used a card scraper and then an orbital sander to get a smooth, flush surface. Remember, use an aggressive grit when trying to level something like this so it doesn't take a long time. Over at the drill press, I used a sanding drum with various grits to clean up the marks from the bandsaw. After that, I rounded over the edges and did some touch-up work with sandpaper. Before I cut a precise taper on the legs, I wanted to get them cut to the correct length. I started by setting my miter gauge to 5 degrees off of 90 and trimming off the bottom of each leg. Then, measuring from the bottom, I marked the top of each leg and cut them on the table saw as well. This cut was made with the gauge set to 5 degrees the other direction off of 90. After marking where I wanted the taper to start and stop, I set up my multi-purpose sled to make the cut. If you haven't watched J-Bait's video on building one of these, be sure to check it out. I used hot glue to add a stop block to the bottom and side of the leg so I could cut the next 2 legs consistently. Each leg gets a chamfer on each of its front edges, and I added that over at the router table in 2 passes. After I transferred the correct measurements to the bottom of the seat, I traced the location of each leg. I then set my router to 3/8 of an inch depth and kind of freehanded the routing getting close to the lines. I finished up the mortise with a knife and a chisel. I did the second mortise the same way, and I finally learned my lesson by the third mortise and scored the line with a knife before routing to make it a little easier. I ended up marking and drilling for a single 3/8 inch dowel in each leg as well, just to give it some extra strength. After transferring the measurements to the seat, I drilled the matching hole in the mortise. While the top and the legs are all 1.5 inches thick, the aprons are about half that thickness or even a little less. I opted to resaw these short pieces on my table saw, and after planing them down to equal thickness, I cut them to final length on the crosscut sled. After marking the start and stop, I transferred the curve to each of the apron pieces. I could have used the bandsaw for this next step, but I opted to use my new scroll saw instead. I knew I'd probably end up with a little less sanding if I used the scroll saw. Each of these aprons sits at 120 degrees to each other. I considered using something like pocket screws, but I wanted to build this whole stool without any metal fasteners, so I opted to make some mortises in each of the legs to accept the aprons. I expected that the laminated footrest would be the most challenging part of this build, but actually figuring out how to make these mortises proved a little bit more difficult for me. I took my time marking out the location of the mortise. I then made myself a 30 degree and 120 degree guide block on the table saw to attempt to chisel these out. This approach works, but I decided to change directions. I cut up the guide blocks into smaller pieces and then glued them up into a mini router jig. I cut out a hardboard top on my scroll saw that the bearing on the router bit could ride against. After lining up the jig with my markings, and after setting the correct bit depth, I was able to pick back up cutting the mortises. I had to repair the jig halfway through, but this still worked way better for me than the chisel. I did pull out the chisel again to trim up the rounded corners and get that mortise ready to go. The mortises ended up being a tiny bit small, so I finessed the aprons with a plane to get it to a tight fit. Putting all these pieces together was a pretty cool moment in the build. Now, the part that you're probably wondering about the most, the footrest. The footrest is laminated from a bunch of thinner strips of wood. I opted to cut these on the bandsaw so I would waste as little material as possible with the kerf of the blade, but I did learn a lot through this process. The first thing I learned is why other woodworkers use a jointer between each cut. As my cuts went along, the edge started getting more and more wavy. After I got them all cut, I learned a second lesson, and this is why other woodworkers use a drum sander to get these things the same thickness. I tried to even out some of the pieces on the planer, and while it helped a little bit, it ended up just ripping the ends off some of these pieces. I had to take a lot of the shorter pieces over to the miter saw and just kind of square up their edges again. Off camera, I had attempted to curve some of these strips around my form and found that the pine was just not thin enough to bend without breaking. From what I've read, other woods like oak would have done this just fine. After talking to a friend and doing some research, I went with this approach. I wrapped the strips in a towel and poured boiling water over them, then quickly wrapped up the plastic bag to keep in some of the steam. I heated up more water and poured that over them a second time. After maybe 10 minutes, I took them out and started bending them around the form to dry. After they were all clamped up, I got them drying in front of a fan. I let the strips of wood dry overnight and monitored the water content in the wood. It started close to 30% at first, and after nearly a day of drying got down to 12% or so. I could have waited longer, but that's when I took them out of their clamps and began the glue up. This was slow going, and I would only glue up a few strips at a time. From what I read, I should have been using something like PVA glue, but I had Type-On 3 and I read that should work as well. I only needed to wait about 2 to 3 hours for the glue to set up before I could unclamp and add a few more strips and then clamp it again. After several laminations had dried, I was actually able to remove the ring off of the form, and the ring held its shape. I couldn't even really flex it. This allowed me to get slightly better clamping pressure with the remaining strips. The footrest took quite a bit of sanding on the top and bottom to even everything out. I originally thought I would stain the stool, so I used what was marketed as a stainable wood filler. I hated this stuff and really wish I had gone with something that was just pine colored. I feel like it stands out like a sore thumb on the finished build. The last remaining cut was the notches in each of the legs to accept that ring. I gave up on taking a just-in-time measurement here and just used my 3D model to figure out the location and depths of the cut to make. I set the blade to a 5-degree tilt and then made a series of cuts at different heights to remove the material for these notches. I cleaned out the remaining wood with a chisel, and then I used the scroll saw for the other two legs. I actually used some of the offcuts from the lamination form I made to make a curved sanding block to kind of sand these mortises a little bit more round. I rounded over all the edges on the footrest, except for the 3 parts that would join to the legs. The glue-up was actually really fun, and the stool went together quickly. The legs and aprons were fairly tight fit, so the primary clamping was really just to hold the legs to the ring. One change I plan to make to the stool is to add dowel reinforcements to the leg and ring joint. Unless you nail those notches and get the curve just right, there's just not as much glue surface as you'd want. After taking off the clamps, it was time to take it for a test drive. I finished the stool with tung oil before taking the final pictures. After attempting a number of shots inside with different lighting setups and different props, I followed my wife's advice to take the pictures outside. The sky was perfectly overcast, and I was thrilled how these final shots turned out. I love how this stool turned out, and I've gotten a lot of encouraging feedback from others that like it also, either from the photos that I posted online, or those that were at the Skytook Adventure in Oklahoma and got to see it in person and sit on it and tell me how comfortable it was. I'll give you fair warning, I've already made some tweaks to this design, and I plan to build it again out of hardwood, probably out of cherry. So if you see a video very much like this one in the future, don't say I didn't warn you. Thank you so much for watching, and if you want to stay in touch, follow me over on Instagram at DNHandcrafted. I'd love to stay in touch in between these build videos, and I post some other projects and things that I'm working on. Until next time, I'll see you later. If you like this video, please consider subscribing and giving it a thumbs up. You also may enjoy some of the other videos I've published.